All right, I want to welcome everybody back to Stories from the Trenches. My name's Juliana Stancompiano, and I'm here today with Paul Petroski. And I'm thrilled to have him on because from the other people that we've been talking to on the podcast, he has another very different slant on kind of how he got into sales enablement, what he's learned from being in this sales enablement world. And I'm excited to have a conversation with him today so that he can share what his experiences has been like as he's navigated this world that, as we all know, is very evolving in nature. So Paul, welcome to the Sales Enablement Society Stories from the Trenches podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to let Paul introduce himself and give a little bit of his background, and then we'll dive into it. So Paul, tell everybody a little bit about your path and career and where you're at today.
Okay. Yeah, I started my career right out of college doing some information technology consulting, which led into a variety of web development, back-end development work. Realized I didn't want to be sitting behind a computer coding all day long, so that led into a career into learning and development, which started predominantly in the technology space, and then that grew into what we called anything organizational capability. So that was anything not leadership or sales. And after several years growing with a very large company in that space, wanted to get into sales enablement, but we weren't calling it sales enablement at the time. And so I had the opportunity to get into a company that was pretty much a young company, post-IPO, but brand new, looking to grow in the sales effectiveness space. And so joined that. A few weeks after joining that, the lady that hired me left, and so I was then running the entire sales effectiveness function. And over the last 6 years have just been growing in my personal experience with sales enablement as the function has grown, and currently with IBM Watson Health, operating in a sales enablement leadership role.
That's great. So it's almost come full circle for you, which I love. You started out in the IT space.
It has.
Now you're like,
yeah,
not
exactly.
doing what you were doing in the beginning.
Not the way I planned it, but
right? Yeah. I wonder if anybody's careers has gone exactly as they've planned it. That's always interesting.
It doesn't happen that way.
Yeah. So I find it really fascinating, and I haven't been able to speak to a lot of practitioners where they do come from that learning development side and end up in sales enablement. Although, as we talked before we started recording, you and I have some similarities in that space. And I find I always get looked at maybe a little bit funny by people that are more, grown up a little bit more through the sales enablement space or through the sales side. So I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about that experience. And I love that it was like, I specifically don't do leadership nor sales.
Right.
So I'd love to tell our listeners a little bit about that transition and how you did it for those that might be looking to try to break into the space from an angle that's not from a sales side.
Yeah, so learning and development obviously has also grown over these last few years. And for me personally, in the last kind of year or two before I jumped into formally sales enablement, I was very interested in performance consulting, which is a discipline within the learning and development space, but I think is getting applied across multiple different areas, where we truly look at a broad perspective of how people perform, and knowing that training is one answer to help people perform, but there's so many different factors that help people either be high performers or struggle to perform. And as I grew in that performance consulting space, that really just drove me into, man, if I can get into sales and there's just tactical ways in which, whether it's quota, whether it's all the metrics that we measure sellers on, I felt like that was a really great career path for me to take this performance consulting discipline that I was growing in and apply it to. And so for me, getting into sales effectiveness, like I said, we called it at the time, was a personal goal because I wanted to take that sales performance consulting discipline and really felt like trying to apply that to a bunch of coders was a lot harder than trying to apply it in the sales space because, again, we just had metrics that we had on salespeople that we didn't have in some of these other areas. And so for me, it started into an e-learning role. So the company that I joined specifically, it was doing e-learning and onboarding for the sales effectiveness function, but then quickly found that sales performance discipline applied in so many different areas, whether I was running ASMs or implementing sales enablement platforms and technology, or just even having conversations about how sellers' comp plans were affecting their performance and their behavior. It really helped me to take a holistic approach as to what I was doing in the enablement space, and then decide, was training an answer to that? Because a lot of times it wasn't, and I think that's what really has helped me grow in my sales enablement career, is really not just being, call it a one-trick pony, not just being about content, not just being about coaching, not just being about training, but trying to figure out how do you put all these pieces together along with technology and collaboration across the organization to truly build a function that can help sellers.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm kind of curious. So it sounds like you got an opportunity essentially and took it to get in on the sales side from a learning perspective with the e-learning, and then grew out your skill set from there based on your background in order to keep, impacting the sales, different sales forces that you were working with. That be accurate?
Correct. And that move was actually kind of a step backwards, I think, career-wise for me a bit, but that was one that I was willing to take because I wanted to get into sales, which, again, just at the company I was at, I didn't have that opportunity. So kind of took a step backwards doing, before I made that change, I was in a management role, and this role was a little bit more hands-on, tactical. Yeah, but, again, that just opened the door for me to get into it and to grow. And like I said, within 2 weeks, the lady that hired me left, and so it was thrown in my lap pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's one way to advance.
Exactly.
And that happens. That's a good, a good place to be at the right time, I guess, to be able to kind of push. It was. I'm curious, did you go out and do any learning of your own in order to be able to go onto the sales side, or what do you do to kind of understand the seller and your new audience versus maybe what you've done before?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a researcher by trade. I love reading. I love reading books, blogs, you name it. You put it in front of me, I'm going to digest it and try to figure out how I integrate it. And so when I was informed that the lady that hired me was leaving after I, cold sweat, didn't sleep for 2 days trying to figure out how I was going to do this job, I just started reading every book out there, whether it was books on methodology like The Challenger, whether it was books that just talked about sellers and how they can be effective. And then just started, as the sales enablement discipline somewhat came to life, whether it was the Sales Enablement Society or some of these other functions, trying to get involved there. Because, I wasn't a seller. I never sold anything in my life. So for me, having to learn what made sellers tick, what they did, what they didn't do, what worked well, what didn't, was a lot of book reading, a lot of interviews with sellers. I really spent a lot of time with direct sellers and just trying to understand how do they, just from how do they run their day to run their weeks to their quarters, just trying to think through in their minds what it is they did and didn't do, and just trying to synthesize all these different perspectives into being able to learn for myself what it is these people were doing that I was trying to support. So it was intimidating at first because I didn't speak the language and I didn't understand. So it was a big learning curve for me to get the lingo and get the understanding and what was a quota plan and what was revenue versus opportunity and all this kind of stuff. But eventually, the more you learn, the more you spend time with people. And I think the big thing too is going even broader than just sellers, in the sense that, while we focus on sales enablement, there's the big buzz right now that it's moving to revenue enablement, right? And that's something that I think any enablement person, whether you call yourself sales enablement or revenue enablement, just understanding that the sellers are truly at the tip of what a company is doing, and the more you can understand what your business is doing, what your company is, what are your CSO or your CEOs thinking about, and what are your revenue numbers, all that kind of stuff, what's running your business, I think that helped, because then that helped me understand where do I put my efforts and focus and time, because I understood the bigger picture of what my company was trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that's good advice, for anybody and people that are listening, is to understand the business, right, of what, holistically what the business is trying to do, and then depending on who you're supporting, try to understand what it is that they're responsible for in order to meet those business goals, and then the enablement or the other functions that are supporting those functions, how do we then service them to be able to help them do the things that the business needs them to do?
Exactly.
So a lot of different layers in there. I want to go back to something that you said earlier that I think is interesting, and could be interesting for our audience as well, is that you said, sometimes when you're going out and you're figuring out what's needed or what's going on, it's not always a training issue. And we see this a lot with clients as well, right? Where they come and they're like, we need X. And it's like, well, what are you trying to solve for? And by the time you uncover it all,
Right.
you realize that you're like, okay, well, sure, you can create some training, but it's not going to fix your problem because, to your point, like maybe it's the way in which somebody's being compensated that's driving some sort of behavior that the company's not excited about. So can you talk more about what you're doing in that case in point and kind of what people's reactions are when you try to uncover
Yeah, and that's hard at
have you
times
ever
when
said,
you have.
no, I won't create that. It's not going to help.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's hard at times because when your C-level executive's coming to you saying, I need training, and you have to somehow build a case to say, no, you don't, that's a tough sell. And especially if there's a time urgency around it, they want it done right now. And the only way you can combat that is through really discovery of trying to dig into understanding at a performance level what's truly going on. And that's where that performance consulting discipline, I think, does a great job of trying to understand the as-is of what are people doing today and the need to be, where do you need to get them. And I think this is where my background in IT has helped, because with doing a lot in the IT space, data has also been a big advocate in my mind. Like everything I think of is from a data perspective. And so when you're trying to address performance, do you have data that supports what's not working today so that you can truly see, is there going to be an impact on the solution that you're going after? So one, just doing a lot of discovery, trying to get to the root of what is going on from a performance perspective. No doubt the executive has a view, but sometimes when you dig into sales leader, sales management, and then get into the sales reps perspective, there's a different view than what the executive is seeing. And so being able to synthesize all those different angles of what the problem's real. You don't never want to denounce the fact that there's a problem, but how do you bring in all those different perspectives to say, here's the different angles to this problem? Because sometimes the executive just doesn't have that lens to it. And so if you can take the time to do the discovery and gather all that, really be a researcher and synthesize all the different information that you're gathering, whether it's interviews, whether it's, again, actual data that's showing where things are going wrong. That then gives you the ammunition to go back and say, based upon everything we see, we agree there is a problem, but here's some recommendations of different solutions. And when you can have that level of conversation, kind of peer-to-peer, then I think you can build some clout to say, I've done the due diligence, and here's why I think there's different solutions. And part of that is you have to be confident, right? You have to be confident in yourself to say, based upon this process, I can come up with a solution that would be different than training if it's needed. And I know for me personally, that was a personal growth area of growing in my confidence to have those conversations and truly believing that the solution that I'm proposing is better than the one that was originally proposed. So it's taking the time of doing that discovery, trying to get data in there if you can, and then just having confidence in yourself to be able to propose something that maybe isn't what was originally proposed.
I think it's such a great point that you bring, and we see this a lot as well. And I think it's good to talk about is, and I'd be curious to know how you do it when you ask kind of for some leeway or some time to say, hey, I hear what you want, and I'd like to do some due diligence before we just go and spend time and money on creating that. What does that look like, or what's your experience been with that? How do you do that?
Yeah, and I think sometimes you have to help whoever's bringing that problem to you understand the potential cost of getting training wrong. The statistics out there of training alone and how much people retain, and you start taking that and breaking that down by, let's say you're going to do a 3-4 day training, you're bringing your entire sales force out of the field, the lost cost opportunity of them being in the field, the cost of them sitting in training, and what you start putting that all together, and there becomes a dollar value that you can put on what's being asked of you, and that could be a pretty expensive value proposition to get wrong. And so if you can have have that kind of level of conversation, then you can begin to say, we don't want to spend $3 million to get this wrong. Let's truly take the time. Again, we've agreed there's a problem. Let's truly take the time to do the due diligence and ensure that the solution that we're putting on the table is right, because it's a lot cheaper to change a process than it is $3 or $4 million to pull people out of the field for training. And so if the process changes really the answer, you're saving a lot of money. And if you can start talking that kind of lingo, then I think you can gain the confidence and the clout. But then you have to deliver, right? And then on the back end, you have to make sure that you're taking the time to do that analysis. Because if you come out of a 3-week period where you ask for time and you didn't really come up with something, then you shoot yourself in the foot. And that's, again, comes back to the confidence aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would call out there, too, that I see is, and we see this a lot, where you're creating a different relationship with your stakeholders than just being people that go and create stuff for them. And sometimes you can just get those requests thrown over the fence, but if you start engaging with them on the business level and having a business level conversation to really understand the need before you just go create whatever it was that they asked you to create, we've seen, at least, through different people that we've worked with, it really starts to elevate your own, kind of place in the business, the meetings that you get invited to, and it widens your own ability to see what's going on for people. Do you find that happens or has happened in that case with you?
I do, and I think that's something that the sales enablement function itself is trying to elevate even more and more. I think I was at one of the Sales Enablement Society meeting in Texas a few years ago, and CSO Insights was talking about the percentage of functions in sales enablement that are now reporting directly to the CEO, and you start seeing those numbers and the conversations about where do we report and what's our seat at the table, because ultimately the sales enablement function itself has a huge opportunity just in what it could do to impact not just sales but revenue for a company. But again, back to what I said earlier, you have to be able to talk the lingo. You have to understand the business. You have to understand what the business is trying to accomplish and goals that sometimes even fall completely outside of what sellers are doing. But the more you can understand that, the more you can talk the talk, which then gives you that credibility to say, yep, you belong here, and sales enablement truly can make an impact. Because if not, as you said, you just become that order taker, and you're seen more as a commodity of you can just create things, you can create content, you can create trainings, as opposed to truly a strategic position that can make an influence in the whole company.
Yeah, that's great. So I'd be curious to know what can you, and I love that we just talked about the elevation of the function, and I think that's essentially the theme that we've been talking about, throughout this, is how to continue to drive from different lenses what's needed for the business through enablement, or even the revenue enablement, as you mentioned, and kind of the interactions that you have to have along the way in order to really get to that strategic level. And I'd be curious to know, it seems to me, and maybe you can just share with the audience, and especially as people are growing in their role, you've said a few times, it takes the confidence. And what I've found, at least for my own self personally, from a confidence perspective, is it takes me to do the work to get the confidence that I know what I'm talking about. And so, what does gaining the confidence mean to you? And I think similarly, and you've talked about going out and doing the research and understanding, but what does that mean from somebody as they develop themselves on this path?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that starts with understanding who you are and who you aren't. CSO Insights book on sales enablement, I think they talk about the clarity model, and I think they do a really good job emphasizing the importance of a charter for any sales enablement team. And that charter doesn't look the same for every company. I think that's one thing we learned in sales enablement, is it looks different depending upon the company and where the company is in their maturation process and what their needs are. A startup is going to look very different than a Fortune 100 company. And so starting with the charter, and that becomes important, because then that helps you define what it is you are and what it is you aren't. I think so many times sales enablement can be that catch-all to say, go do this, go do that, and then you pull yourself in so many different directions, you don't feel confident that you're effective in any one thing.
thing. And so if you can get that charter or something that truly defines, again, what you are and what you aren't, that then gives you the ability to grow and truly emphasize. And like you say, tactically, I've done this, if our job from a sales enablement perspective is to really make sure our onboarding is really good, we understand the time to productivity, we understand how to design the program, well, then we can do that really, really well. And then the more you do that, the more confident you are that you're doing your job. And then that gives you more confidence to say, we can do more, we can do better, we can be more strategic, we can start talking more about fundamental revenue numbers and performance impacts and all that kind of stuff. But it has to start with, you have to see those successes and you have to believe that you're making a difference. And if you're pulled in so many different directions, it's hard to do that because you just don't know, am I being effective anywhere, because I'm trying to be effective everywhere. So I think that charter becomes important. Once you have that charter, truly being great at those things that are within that charter, so that you have confidence to know that you're really hitting it out of the park in those areas. And then as it's kind of like the snowball effect. As you start doing those little things in those areas that you're really set on, then you start growing in your confidence to say, yeah, we can tackle more, we can go bigger, we can become more impactful. Because I don't think you just walk in and say, hey, I read CFO Insights book and we need to be strategic and we need to get that seat at the table. It doesn't work that way. But you deliver and you actually show the impact you're having. You take a metrics and a data-driven approach and you show the impact. We took our time to productivity from 92 days down to 83 days. You start showing that stuff and talking that language of the business. I think that builds your own confidence, and then people start recognizing that, and they say, hey, well, let's give sales enablement this function, or let them do this, and you start seeing you get invited to those conversations that maybe you weren't before.
Yeah, that's great. So in part, and why we're doing this podcast series is to highlight the things that people are doing and actually how it's working so that we can share that with our audience, right? Especially as people are coming up and people that have been in role or want to make changes, is that sometimes it feels like somebody does read a book and then they just, and there's some magic thing that happens. We don't know what
right.
And so if we can eliminate what the magic thing is, it makes it so it can scale to more people and more organizations. So I appreciate you kind of walking us through that as I keep digging down into how do you do that?
Right. Well, and I think another thing is just your peers, right? Like when I was with the company that I jumped into with sales enablement, I was a one-person team. Again, that lady hired me, she left, and I was a one-person team. And so the benefit of the Sales Enablement Society and some of these other grassroots movement is to say, get together with your peers, learn from other people, understand what other people are doing, and just have dialogue to say you're not on an island, but there are other people out there as well, because then I think that just gives you ideas and births the opportunity to build that confidence and benchmark yourself against where other people are at.
Yeah, completely. Well, so we're running right up against the amount of time that we spend, but I'm just curious, is there any kind of last thoughts that you would leave the audience around kind of getting in and elevating through a sales enablement lens and coming from the background that you have of the learning and development side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is know your niche, know where you've come from, know what you're good at. So in my world, I came from learning and development. So whether it was implementing learning platforms that focused enablement or designing curriculum, designing whatever from a learning perspective, I felt very confident in that, was able to bring that to the table. Where I wasn't so confident, again, was growing in some of these other areas. So I think I would leave just, hey, know where you come from, know what you're good at, really focus on that, but then become a student of the trade. Again, sales enablement is just growing phenomenally, and being a part of it is just so cool because we watch as the function has grown underneath our feet. And so, but that's scary too, because you have to know, you have to grow in content and coaching and these other areas that are all part of what makes sellers be effective. And sometimes that's intimidating, but we can't be afraid of that. I think the more we can learn about that stuff, the more we can dive into it and eventually grow and become more well-rounded. I think if you can get all those tools in your toolbox over time, it really sets you up to be effective in a sales enablement career, and just makes you a very valuable commodity to any company.
Yeah, that's great. It's true. It's like you said earlier with the definition. It's like there's a lot of definitions out there, and I don't know that there's one that's going to fit for everybody, because everybody's in different stages at their company of what it means for them. And so it is that constant evolution where, you know, we probably all feel like we're constantly learning ourselves and figuring it out as we go.
Right.
It is so new, which is kind of the fun part of it, and why the Sales Enablement Society was born in the first place. So it's a great time to be in it.
And we have to do all that without anybody in our company really telling us we're doing it right or not. Because nobody else really knows what we're supposed to be doing.
Exactly. Yeah, we've run into that too, like to your point of the executives, where you're like, why did he just ask me if we're doing more role plays? What is that? You know, because they don't know what it is either. So we're all educating together. Nice. Well, Paul, I really appreciate the time and conversation today. And it was a lot of great insight for our audience, and the best, and hopefully we'll see you at the conference upcoming.
You bet. Thanks for having me.